world has shrunk. We are in a period of remarkable tension.
Climate change and migration.
Emerging technologies.
Artificial intelligence.
Economic opportunities. Global health.
What is happening in Gaza.
Ukraine and Russia.
A situation in Sudan.
It's a messy world.
Mr. President, welcome to Chicago.
Chicago is a convergence of people and ideas and cultures from all over the world.
We are hoping that by listening to this conversation, we're then move into real advocacy and action.
Fight is about everyday work, about your everyday contribution. Even small steps matter.
We need to do something now.
This is about democracy.
Inclusion, real inclusion.
Listening to one another.
What do you see as the path forward?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here on sort of a nasty, rainy night in Chicago, but thank you guys for taking the time. I'm Tom Wyler. I'm going to be interviewing Eddie tonight. I'm on the board here at the council and a partner at the advisory firm Hacklet. We're going to have a really interesting, I think, well-timed conversation this evening. I'm going to give you a little bit about Eddie's background quickly, and then we'll launch into a broader discussion that hopefully will strike everybody in this room is relevant for all that's going on in the world at the moment. But Eddie Fishman, who is with us tonight, is the author of a new best-selling book, Choke Points: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. He is a senior research scholar at Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy and an adjunct professor of international and public affairs. And he was from 2015 to 2017 on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the State Department, advising on Europe and Eurasia and leading work on economic sanctions and strategic planning. Prior, he served as Russia and Europe lead in the Office of Economic Sanctions Policy, designing sanctions in response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and worked on the Iran sanctions team and was awarded the State Department's Superior Honor Award twice and its Meritorious Honor Award for his work. Before we begin, I was told that I have to read this, and since I was once a lawyer, I'm going to read it very specifically. We would like to remind everyone that today's program is on the record, and any views expressed by either of us at the council are our own and do not reflect any institutional positions. With that, we're going to sort of jump into it. Like I said at the top, this could not be more well-timed for Eddie and me to be having this conversation. And as you heard from his background, he's sort of the perfect person to be sitting here. Not only has he written this book, but he's actually worked on these issues. He's been a practitioner. Some of the themes of sort of what I wanted to unpack tonight with Eddie, and then we'll get into audience Q&A in a moment, are about some of these tools of economic statecraft and whether they are sort of merely effective tactically or whether or not they can also be strategic tools. And we'll sort of get to that, and I think you'll notice that that's going to be a theme of the evening. But maybe first, if we could just start out, I'd be curious to know why you wrote this book. Like it happens to be, for a lot of reasons, as we were talking about a moment ago, it's on the New York Times bestseller list. Your timing could not have been better. But when you started out this project, you didn't know that. So what was driving you to write this story?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Tom, and thank you all for being here. It's been a while since I've been in Chicago, and I'm just reminded by how magnificent of a city it is, even when it's raining. So thank you for being here tonight. So my motivation for writing the book, Choke Points, really dates to my time in government. And actually, Tom didn't mention this, but he also worked in government at the same time. And I remember distinctly in the wake of the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, sitting in the Situation Room, debating what to do about it. And when we would talk about the topic of whether or not to arm the Ukrainians, to provide the Ukrainians with javelins, it was a really intense debate where you had really tough opinions from the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, the Joint Staff. Everyone had an informed opinion. And that was sort of what the debate was like. And then when we would talk about things like sanctions or economic warfare, the room would oftentimes just go quiet. And at most, maybe one or two people would feel empowered to weigh in. And I think what I realized at the time was that even though the United States was using tools like sanctions, like export controls, more and more and more, and using them for important purposes, like trying to get Iran to stop building a nuclear weapon, knowledge of how these tools worked was so small that even top people in the government didn't feel empowered to weigh in at a high level. And by the way, this was true not only at sort of the expert level, but even when you got to higher levels of government. And I left government thinking that we're living in an age of economic warfare. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls had already become by then kind of the primary way that the United States and other great powers were competing with each other. And we just didn't have the intellectual capital in the US government to actually craft effective strategies. And if you think about that, it's not just a problem in DC, it's a problem broadly. It's a problem of what we learn about in our schools. You go to a school to study public policy, you learn a lot about the history of wars, military history, and you will learn almost nothing about how economic wars are fought. And so it was really from that experience that I started teaching at Columbia, designed a class there that I've been teaching now for a while on economic statecraft. And it was really during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, when there was unprecedented sanctions imposed on Russia, that my students basically came to me and said, Professor, you really should turn this into something where you can share it with a broader audience. And so that's when I started writing the book. And I'd say my highest aspiration for choke points, and if you talk to me in 10 years and say, are you happy with this or not, will be whether or not it contributes to really inspiring more and more people in our country to learn about these topics, to feel like they're empowered to weigh in, not just in the Situation Room, but everywhere, in places like Chicago, my home city of Philadelphia. Because as we're seeing now, these topics affect our lives as Americans, and we need to be informed about them.
Well, I've been to a lot of council events and done a lot of these, and I suspect with this audience, you're going to have a lot of people weighing in. Would be my guest tonight, I hope. So maybe at first we can talk a little bit about the book, and then we're going to turn to some current events. The central argument in many respects of the book is that this age is different, right? That this era is different, but in some ways, the reality is that critical inputs aren't new, right? Mediums of exchange aren't new. We've had blockades. We had blockades in Civil War, right? I mean, we all know the history of World War II, which, in many respects, an embargo pushed us into the war. In some respects, there's been an embargo on Cuba for decades, right? So, is there something that is fundamentally different? Is it structurally different, or is it just that the tools we're using today are different?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because this is, I think, something that's really important. It really gets at the crux of why I call our current age the age of economic warfare. It's really what I think comes after the globalization era, which I grew up in the 1990s. And I think the best way to show why economic warfare today is different from economic warfare in ancient Greece or in Napoleonic Europe or in the Civil War is to look at really what economic warfare looked like right on the eve of what I call the age of economic warfare. And that's the 1990s. So the canonical case of economic sanctions in the 1990s, which doesn't seem like that long ago to me at least, was the UN embargo on Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So as some of you may remember, in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, a neighboring state, and annexed it. And right afterwards, within 24 hours, the UN actually imposed a full-scale embargo on Iraq. And the most important objective of this embargo was to stop Iraq from selling oil on global markets. The embargo actually wound up staying in place for 13 years, all the way up until George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003. And the way that embargo was implemented, the way that the UN and the US actually stopped Iraq from selling oil, was through a 13-year, 24/7 naval patrol of the Persian Gulf. US warships with teaming up with 20 other countries, patrolling the Persian Gulf, inspecting vessels coming in and out of Iraq's ports. And when they were suspicious that a tanker was carrying Iraqi oil, they would dispatch a team on helicopters to the ship to take a sample of oil and send it to a laboratory for testing to ascertain where it came from. So if you think about it, even as recently as the 1990s, really tough, hard-hitting economic warfare was just an offshoot of military force. That Iraq embargo, to the extent someone in Washington was running it, it was the Pentagon, right? It was the Navy that was running it. It wasn't the Commerce Department or the State Department or the Treasury Department. And really, even in the early 21st century, when you thought about impactful sanctions, it was you needed full UN backing and you needed the willingness to interdict cargo, interdict ships. What happened, and the thing that's new, was in the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, both China and Russia enter the global financial system and international supply chains. You had sort of a narrower form of globalization that starts after World War II that really only encompasses the advanced industrial democracies. But in the 90s, everyone sort of joins the global economy. And so what that means is all of a sudden, starting in the early part of the 21st century, the US finds out that we have the ability to use that international financial system to impose really devastating sanctions on foreign countries. And so we get up to the present where there's a system where now Donald Trump can sit in the Oval Office, sign a document, and just by signing that document, impose incredible economic harm on a foreign country without deploying a single US soldier, without risking a single American life. And so what these choke points, like the US dollar, which are areas of the US, of the global economy where one state has a dominant position and there are few, if any, alternatives. What these choke points enabled was a world in which the threshold for the use of aggressive economic warfare for the US has gone way down, but the impact has gone way up. And so you almost have something like a moral hazard, where it's very easy to impose really devastating economic harm on foreign countries, and you don't have to risk anything really to do it.
So it's such an interesting question, right? It's the old adage of fight without fighting, right? Sun Tzu, the goal of warfare is to fight without fighting. So, we're now living in an age where I suspect that many in this room are paying attention to it, is that let's stick with your argument for a moment, right? And the idea is that, the cost of kinetic war, the human costs, the economic costs and the political costs were too high. So these tools of economic statecraft actually reduce those. Well, it turns out that as you look around the world today, it might be that the economic and the political costs of using these tools are actually a little bit higher than people thought. So do you think that the golden age of economic statecraft and using these tools, is it behind us?
So, well, it depends what we define by golden age. It's a loaded term. Do I think that we are going to see economic warfare dissipate? Are we going to see fewer sanctions and fewer tariffs in the years ahead? No. Simple answer. I think that there are structural reasons that we're seeing more and more economic warfare. And the way I would sort of simplify it, if I was just going to sort of explain it, it's that the global economy is still designed for the benign geopolitical environment of the 1990s, but we're living in a period of intensifying geopolitical competition. So there's this mismatch between a global economy that assumes that the US and China are friends and the US and Russia are friends, and a reality where we are enemies. And so that is sort of the struggle. When you think about sanctions, tariffs, export controls as sort of this haphazard way of undoing globalization brick by brick by brick, I think it kind of makes it clear why people as ideologically diverse as Barack Obama and Donald Trump have been using these tools more and more and more. Do I think that that we're gonna, that we're gonna feel more blowback at home? Yes, as well. And I think this is actually one of the kind of ironic macro narratives that cut across my book, Choke Points, because in addition to this hyper-globalization period of the 1990s, where you really do find a globalized, dollarized financial system, another major factor why the US turns to economic warfare more and more in the 2000s and the 2010s is because the use of military force loses its political luster in the United States. In the wake of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, both the Democratic and Republican Party basically lose their appetite for the use of force. And it's very different, by the way. It's sometimes hard to put ourselves back in that mindset. But if you go back to the 90s, we used military interventions all over the world, semi-regularly, right? I mean, in the Balkans, in parts of Africa and Latin America, it was a more regular sort of part of US statecraft in the 90s than it became after Afghanistan and Iraq. But the irony, I think, is that economic warfare, sure, when you use it against North Korea or Iran, it may not affect us. But then when you start using it against Russia, and then especially against China, you do feel significant blowback at home. And it's not just blowback that's being felt on a limited number of American families whose children volunteer for military service. It's felt on all of us through inflation, through scarcity, through higher prices, through slower economic growth. And so I do think that in some ways, we're now realizing that these weapons do have a cost.
So, you are, as I said at the outset, certainly at this point, but you have been for some time, one of the world's leading thinkers about economic statecraft and economic sanctions. What are some of the common patterns that you've seen where the application of them has really gone terribly awry, or actually when it's worked well. And I go back to the theme that I am going to sort of stick on throughout the evening of whether or not they're tactically effective or strategically effective. But I'm curious, where have they worked really well and where have they worked really badly?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with what's going wrong, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because we'll move into the more optimistic side of things over time. I don't think you mentioned this in my intro, but I had the good fortune of doing a short stint at the Pentagon, in addition to working at the State Department and the Treasury Department, where I got to work for then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marty Dempsey, as one of his advisors. And I was sort of the token civilian on the team of military officers. And it was a really eye-opening experience for me, because what I got to see was how the Pentagon prepares for war. And what they do is, they start with recruiting and training professional troops who spend, in many cases, decades preparing to fight and win wars. You actually create options for different scenarios. So, for instance, if tomorrow, God forbid, China were to invade Taiwan, the Pentagon has military options that they've vetted and that they've rehearsed over time. And they've done tabletop exercises to try to find the holes in those plans. And then they do military exercises where they actually go into the theater and prepare and see sort of what are the holes in their plan. And so by the time someone like the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is giving his or her best military advice to the president, that best military advice is based on a very thorough and rigorously thought out approach. As you would know as well as I do, Tom, with economic warfare, the norm is a crisis happens, we all scramble to the Situation Room and say, oh my God, what do we do? And there are no options vetted. We are racing to try to understand what the economic impact would be of imposing sanctions on Sberbank under incredible time pressure, worrying that we might reinflame the Eurozone crisis. And of course, in that kind of scenario, you wind up with kind of half measures, because one thing, and this is I don't want to spoil any of my book for you because I want you guys to read it. But one common theme you see over every single sanctions program is during this kind of like anxiety-inducing race to come up with options. Someone at the Treasury Department's crunching numbers and trying to come up with what the impact is going to be, and they always give these sky is falling estimates that if we impose sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran, it's going to push oil prices to $300 a barrel, and our economy is going to fall into a depression. These are literally what we come up with. And it's because, you think about it, the stressed out economist at Treasury who's asked to do this, deliver this report, within 24 hours, they're worried about protecting downside. They're not thinking about upside. And so I think too often, because of this, because of kind of the haphazard way we do strategy with sanctions, we wind up basically doing just a little bit, but not enough, right? So we don't do nothing, we do a little bit, but not enough. And I think that is the tragedy, frankly, of the sanctions program that's nearest and dearest to my heart, the one that I was most involved in, which is the Russia sanctions, where, we had so many opportunities to really show Putin that there were devastating costs to literally trampling over another sovereign country, trying to conquer another country. And time and again, we missed that opportunity. And I think it was because of that sort of lack of strategy, lack of, this sort of like crunch to do it. And so, if I could sort of wave a magic wand and change anything about how we do economic warfare, it would be to treat it as seriously as the Pentagon treats military force, to have that kind of a rigorous process, to come up with sanctions options, to vet them, to do the forecasting ahead of time, so that tomorrow, if we do find out that China is about to quarantine or invade Taiwan, we have rigorously vetted options that we can present to the president to potentially execute.
So just to level set on this, because I want to drill down on the Russia piece more. That was exactly where I was going. So moving from kind of the theory of the book to some current-ish events. Eddie alluded to this before, but we actually first met, and what he was referring to was that period after Russia first invaded Crimea. So we're not talking about the more recent invasion, but the initial one back in February of 2014, if I remember correctly, was when we first started working together on some of these exact issues. And you made the point, and I think it comes up a lot in various conversations, particularly about that era. There's a lot of criticism about what we and all of us sort of who were in those rooms came up with in the Obama era with respect to sanctions. But then you fast forward, not quite a decade, but almost a decade until the more recent full-scale invasion. The sanctions came at, frankly, a blistering pace in scope, right? Including on the Russian central bank, banning Russian banks from SWIFT, things that 10 years earlier, if we had proposed, we would have been fired.
Immediately.
Literally, it would have been absolutely unimaginable to do those things. And then you get to 2022, and they happen almost immediately, right? But yet, the Russia economy and the war machine sort of continue to, in many respects, tick on. So let's diagnose, we're not as far out from it, but let's take a moment and sort of diagnose more recently, after the full-scale invasion, having had some historical perspective, what did they get wrong that time? Where did they misfire sort of the second time around when they had a chance to do it, and you and I weren't there?
Yeah, sure. So if it's okay, I think in order to answer that fully, I also want to look back at 2014, because even though in the US, 2014 feels like a long time ago, right? Obama, John Kerry, in Russia, it's the same people. Putin, Lavrov, I remember being on calls with Kerry and Lavrov, and now, Lavrov is on calls with Marco Rubio, right? These guys are the same guys. And so I think it's important because, to understand the decision makers in Russia. And if you go back to 2014, I think, to be fair to us, you have to have a little empathy where I remember the last Monday in February showing up at the State Department on the 7th floor, seeing, TVs showing CNN of the little green men showing up in Crimea. And we were learning about it at the same time as everybody else was. And so we were totally caught unaware. And it took us 5 months to build a coalition of the willing with the Europeans to impose what we called at the time scalpel-like sanctions on Russia in the summer of 2014, where we cut off the big Russian banks and energy companies and defense firms from Western capital markets. And at the time, we sort of assumed that those sanctions would narrow Russia's economic horizons, but not send Russia into an immediate economic crisis. And that was, in fact, the bargain we struck with the Europeans. The Europeans did not want Russia to fall into an immediate economic crisis because they worried it would be bad for the European economy. However, and this is something that's almost forgotten by history, but I think it's really important and something that I emphasize in choke points, is in the second half of 2014, the global oil price totally collapsed, fell from over $100 a barrel to something like $50 a barrel in a matter of 4 or 5 months. And so if you look at Russia's economy in December of 2014 and January of 2015, the economy was contracting at an annualized rate of 10%. So an incredible economic crisis. Worse, by the way, than Iran in the lead up to the nuclear deal. And it was because of the combined impact of the sanctions we did and the falling oil price. And in early January, February, there was a debate. Should we ratchet up sanctions more? Should we arm the Ukrainians again? This is another topic that came up again. And really try to get Russia out of the Donbass, because at the time they were still fighting it. They were fighting in the Donbass. And Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, then the German and French presidents, basically said, hold on a second. These sanctions were supposed to be scalpel-like. We weren't supposed to have Russia's economy falling by 10%. And it was then, at that moment, that Merkel and Hollande got together, got on a flight to Minsk, the Belarusian capital, in February of 2015, got together with Putin and Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, and signed the Minsk ceasefire in February of 2015. The ceasefire, mind you, was not worth the paper it was written on. The Russians were violating it as they were signing it, literally as they were signing it. And we did nothing about it. We didn't increase sanctions at all. And in fact, a couple months later, in May of 2015, the Germans signed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline deal with Putin. And so if you think about it, what does Putin take from that experience? What does Lavrov take from that experience? It's that, wow, the West really has the power to crush my economy if they want to, but they don't have the spine to do it. These democracies in the US and Europe, they care too much about, their own domestic economy. They don't want gasoline prices to go up by 10 cents, and they're not willing to actually stand up to me. And so I think this was a really dangerous lesson that Putin took in 2014, 2015. And by the way, it got worse. In 2016, Russia blatantly interfered in the US election. Obama threatened Putin with sanctions, and then we didn't do any sanctions, even after Trump won. We did a little bit, but nothing significant. And then, of course, even worse, Trump comes into the White House in 2017, and for 4 years, gives Putin an entire free pass. So I give you this history because I think we have to also be empathetic with the Biden administration, where you go to the fall of 2021, where you've got 100,000 Russian troops around the Ukrainian border, and Joe Biden saying, if you invade Ukraine, I will impose the most severe sanctions that have ever been imposed. Putin is like, yeah, right. I've seen that story. It's been 7 years or whatever, and I've survived this, and you're not going to have the stomach to do it. And I think the tragedy of this situation is if you look at just the numbers, clearly Russia underestimated the sanctions that Biden would impose. The best example, you mentioned the Central Bank of Russia. Within 48 hours of the Russian invasion in 2022, the US plus the G7 imposes sanctions on the Central Bank of Russia. The Central Bank of Russia, by the way, at the time was the biggest sanctions target in modern history. They had something like $640 billion in assets. And fully half of those assets were sitting in European, American, Japanese, and British bank accounts. So again, let's just use psychology. If the Russians actually thought that the most severe sanctions that have ever been imposed were going to come, do you think they would have left half of their central bank reserves sitting for us to freeze? No. Basically, this was a giant miscalculation in which years of the West not standing up to Putin basically allowed Putin to misjudge our will. And so I think that is the tragedy of the Russia sanctions.
Well, okay, so I was gonna take us on to Trump stuff, but I'm gonna just pause on this for a second, because I suppose in a way the question is, did he misjudge it? I go back to this theme that I want to talk about of the tactics versus strategy. Again, I remember by 2015 when the four of them met in Minsk and signed those documents, I remember what was going on, and we did not have the appetite politically and economically for any pain in the United States. Really, I think during most of the Biden period, really we didn't. And so, yes, the sanctions on Russia were and are quite severe. We aren't suffering the consequences here in the United States. The Europeans, every year hope for a warmer winter. But was Putin wrong? I mean, do we have the stomach? Does the West have the stomach to use these tools in a way that is sort of strategically significant to avoid having to come back a decade later to fight the same battle?
I think Biden did about as good as I would have hoped. I think the one thing Biden was disappointing on was oil, right? Where ultimately he wasn't willing to take the Russia sanctions from like an 8 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10. He wasn't willing to go full Iran-style sanctions because he was worried that if we were to impose really aggressive sanctions on Russian oil, that it would spike global oil prices and worsen inflation in the US. Again, to be a little bit empathetic to Biden, in 2022, oil prices were above $100 a barrel, and we had inflation at the highest levels that it had been since the 1970s. So I think his concerns were legitimate. And so what the US really did was they tried to maximize pressure on Russia without going after oil aggressively. And I think the result of that was that Russia's economy did wither, but just on a slower timeline than it would have otherwise. But I think sometimes the narrative on Russia sanctions is like, wow, Russia's economy is thriving. They're doing great. I mean, It's been 3 years since the war started, right? It's not that long. And right now, what does Russia's economy look like? I mean, they're in stagflation, right? Zero economic growth this year. The benchmark interest rate is 21%. By the way, it would be significantly higher if it weren't for the fact that the Kremlin actually intervened in the Central Bank of Russia's decision-making at the end of 2024 to stop Nabulina from raising interest rates higher, something that we may, if you can relate to here in the United States. You can't get a home mortgage in Russia for anything below 30%. There's effectively no investment in Russia's economy besides the military-industrial complex, which all it does is recruit Russians and send them on the front line to die in Ukraine. So, I mean, the Russian economy is going nowhere fast. And I think part of the reason that Putin is so desperate for a deal with Trump right now is that the economic technocrats in Russia know that they only have 1 or 2 years left at this pace. And by the way, again, 3 years is not that long of a time. You look at the Iran sanctions that led to the nuclear deal. They started in earnest in 2006. We got the joint plan of action, which froze Iran's nuclear program, in 2013. So that's a 7-year process. So if within 3 years we got Russia where they are now, you got to say, Biden did a pretty good job. I think had he been willing to go after oil, maybe we would have been in this situation 2 years earlier. We would have had, Donald Trump managing the situation. So I do think that was an error ultimately.
So, I don't know if most of the people in the room have had a chance to read Choke Points yet, or if they will, but the premise of Choke Points, which I think you probably have picked up on here, the contemporary key choke point, of course, is the dollar, the strength of the dollar. And so if I could just transition us for a moment to talk about what's going on today and talk about the Trump administration, in particularly around the question of the dollar, because I do think it is really important at the moment. The dollar as the world's reserve currency is often referred to by people who have sort of friends of ours and sort of people who've worked in areas that we worked in, is exorbitant privilege, right? There's costs and there are certainly benefits that come with the dollar being the reserve currency, right? It keeps borrowing rates low, it gives us the choke point power, right? But also it ends up being part of the driver of the trade deficit. So with this administration, I'd be curious to get your take on it because, I think about this pretty much all day, every day, and I do not know whether or not they want a strong dollar or a weak dollar. Does this administration want a strong dollar or a weak dollar, Eddie?
Yeah, I think the answer is both, which I think is a problem. I'll explain. So there are, I think, some of the economic thinkers within the current Trump administration have explicitly, including Stephen Miran, the head of the Council on Economic Advisors, have made the argument that the overvaluation of the dollar, basically because the dollar is the world's reserve asset, the world's reserve currency, there's more demand for dollars that would exist if it were just based on our exports. And as a result, the dollar is more valuable. And what that means is certain US companies that export goods to foreign markets find that their goods are less competitive on those markets because the dollar is more valuable. Of course, doesn't talk about all the benefits of the dollar. We have some of which you mentioned, like the fact that we're all paid in dollars, and it's a good thing that our paychecks go a longer way, right? We're richer because the dollar is a stronger currency. So there are some people in Trump's orbit who want to see the dollar at least be devalued to a certain extent. At the same time, Trump himself is petrified of the dollar losing its status as the world's reserve currency. And the best way to know this, you don't actually have to read his mind. You just read his Truth Social, where literally on 3 different occasions, he's threatened 100% tariffs against the BRICS if they create a currency to rival the dollar. Don't want to spoil anything. The BRICS aren't going to create this currency anytime soon. So he's not really, making a threat against a legitimate concern. But at the same time, it shows that he's very anxious about this idea that other currencies could emerge. What I ultimately argued in my book, Choke Points, and I think unfortunately, I think we're seeing some of this come to fruition, is that the biggest threat to the dollar doesn't come from China, the Chinese RMB, doesn't come really from any other currency. It comes from ourselves, right? It comes from the concern that we might be using this economic power, this economic warfare, arbitrarily and capriciously, in a way that, could scare away not just our adversaries, but also our allies. The threat to the dollar comes from the concern that we could potentially undermine the rule of law domestically. Because if you think about a big reason other governments and other companies in other countries like using the dollar is they trust our legal system here in the US. They trust the sanctity of our contracts. And then, of course, a threat to the dollar comes from the concern that we could undermine the independence of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, I think, it's this wonky institution, but really since the global financial crisis has effectively been almost de facto or almost de jure the global lender of last resort through swap lines, right? Like the entire global financial system relies on the Fed as a backstop. And if other central banks start worrying that in a crisis, Trump might politicize the Fed, that becomes an existential financial concern. And I think the thing that's very worrying is in the last couple of weeks, we've almost seen the perfect storm of all 3 of those factors, where you see just an incredibly broad and I think, frankly, non-strategic use of tariffs. You see real concern that Trump is violating court orders with respect to, deportations. And just today, direct threats on Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve. And so I think with those 3 factors, coupled with the fact that the U.S. economy is just not doing well, most people expect a recession this year. European equities are outperforming the U.S. stock market. We're seeing a flight to safety, with safety being the euro, the Swiss franc, the yen, and the pound. And I think that's a real concern because it suggests to me that the dollar has lost some of its luster, and there is a real opportunity not just for the RMBs of the world, but also even for the euro.
Well, okay, so this brings me to a very closely related question, right? The first term, was sort of famously said that Donald Trump paid attention to the stock market to kind of keep track of his presidency, just score his presidency. So far in this term, he honestly seemed pretty unperturbed as the market was going down. But as Treasury yields went up and the dollar was going down, there was a degree of panic that clearly set in, and they stopped. And they changed course, and they paused for 90 days. And Trump seemed to contradict what his advisors said the reasoning was. But why was the bond market, Eddie, that scared them so much, where they were kind of indifferent to the equity markets, or somewhat.
Yeah, I think this actually loops back to what I said earlier, where Trump actually does really worry about the dollar losing its role as the world's reserve currency. And normally, just to walk through how this works, typically, if you were to see Treasury yields go up, that would mean that there would be more demand for treasuries because you're getting a higher yield, and the dollar would strengthen. That's how the dollar has worked, right? And also, when there's general uncertainty in financial markets, the dollar has been a safe haven currency. The fact that you had this sort of unusual situation that Tom just mentioned, in which you saw treasury yields go up as the dollar was going down, that's actually what you expect to see in an emerging market when you have a situation like capital flight, right? And so I think for people in the Trump administration, like Scott Bessent, who spent his career working in financial markets, this was like alarm bells going off in their head. And I think not just Bessent, but even Wall Street CEOs who had been honestly quite, said only very nice things about the Trump administration started being, sounding the alarm, right? I mean, Jamie Dimon going on Fox News, right, to basically say, hold on a second. And I think that got Trump's attention. Quick point, and maybe this is, hopefully incentivize you guys to read choke points more, is, there's a big section of the book which explores the making of Trump's economic warfare policy, specifically with respect to China during the first term. And writing that section, I really had to feel like I got to know how the Trump administration operates. And I see a lot of parallels between the second Trump administration and the first. And one thing that was very clear to me doing this research is that the way Trump runs the ship is he allows a tremendous amount of entrepreneurialism, experimentation, and factionalism within his own administration. He basically allows multiple people to pursue different policies at the same time. And basically, these different factions kind of wait until Trump is in the mindset to support them, and then they kind of put their proposal on his desk. It seems like what happened with these reciprocal tariffs is that Peter Navarro and the really extremely hawkish trade people in the White House had their moment to, Trump, you've been, Mr. President, you've been saying that this is Liberation Day. You got to go big. And they gave him this proposal and he signed off on it, right? But I think what's happened in the week since, particularly with the bond market, going a bit haywire and, getting warnings from everyone from, Ken Griffin, I know Chicago person, Jamie Dimon. I think what has happened is that Navarro and those folks have been discredited a little bit. And there's an opportunity right now for Scott Bessent and some of the more traditional financial minds within the Trump orbit to kind of have their day and to try to shape policy. That's why I think, by the way, Bessent seems to be leading on negotiations with Japan. So I think if they are seen to be successful, if the next 90 days are a success in Trump's view, maybe that will lead to a change in course. And so if you need a little bit of optimism, it's possible that, that you could have a little bit more of a rational economic policy from Trump moving forward.
I think that's an extremely astute analysis. I am cognizant of time, so I have two more questions that I want to raise, and then I'm going to turn it over to our audience. Just quickly, I realize I have a whole sort of stack of questions here about China. We haven't even talked about China, but one of the things that I do want to ask you about China, just quickly, and sort of a macro question. Right, a few months ago, the world basically stopped for a moment. Is DeepSeek unveiled its LLM that it had basically trained for only ostensibly $6 million, right? There's so many different angles to unpack for that. But, again, from our sort of narrow corner of the world, one of the things that was much discussed is whether or not the export controls, the restrictions on the really high-end chips that had been in place at that point for some period of time had just completely not worked. And so I guess my question for you is this, is at this point, is China in particular an example, again, of the tactical efficacy of these versus the strategic, of a market that is just so big and so sophisticated and in its own respect so strong that the limits of the dollar and our tools, not just the dollar, but American tools, the choke points, have the limits of those choke points been laid bare?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's important to note that the choke points that give my book the title is not just the dollar, right? There are other key parts of the global economy where one country has a dominant position and then they can weaponize against others. And I think another key one that the US controls has been the value chain for semiconductors. In particular, the tooling and software that are required to produce high-end chips and the designs from companies like NVIDIA. So the strategy on export controls vis-a-vis China that started during the Trump administration and that was really sort of kicked into high gear during the Biden administration was very different from economic warfare against Iran and Russia. The Iran and Russia sanctions really were to try to put pain on those economies and then translate that pain into political outcomes. With China, the export controls actually had no behavioralist calculus at all. It was just, let's try to stay ahead of China in artificial intelligence. Let's stop Huawei from dominating global 5G networks, right? So it was much more about an attritional strategy, basically keeping America's lead in certain technologies as opposed to really a strategy to change their behavior. The theory of the case, at least with respect to artificial intelligence, is that by constraining China's access to high-end chips, we would give US AI companies like OpenAI, like Anthropic, a lead that would be effectively sustainable over time because companies like DeepSeek wouldn't have access to the computing power they would need. What I will say is that what we found is that producing really advanced large language models, computing power is just one input, right? There's also engineering talent. China's training way more engineers than we do in the US. And I worry that if we're not going to allow any immigrants into the US, that lead is going to go even more ahead than we have now. There's also, differences in culture. So I think that we have, to a certain extent, given US companies a leg up with respect to having access to, H100 NVIDIA chips, whereas China doesn't. But that is not going to be enough to keep a lead over China. The question, I think, for policymakers, and one that I don't think is necessarily going to be answered strategically right now, is does the 6 to 12 month lead that these export controls give us, is that worth the diplomatic tension and friction that it causes in the US-China relationship? I think that's been a toss-up up until now. Right now, I think, unfortunately, they're just bigger fish to fry in the US-China relationship. We got over 100% tariffs on them. So I think right now there's not much really inhibiting us from doing things like stopping NVIDIA even from selling their lower-end chips to Huawei or to China, which is something that Trump just did a few days ago.
There's a line starting to go here. So I'm going to table my last question, and I'm going to just turn it over to some folks in the audience to ask a question. I guess my one, maybe two ask is maybe just give us your name and just try and, be relatively brief with a pointed question.
Okay, my name is Dermot Horgan. We've been talking high politics and high finance. We're here in Illinois, a major manufacturing state, major agricultural state, major financial center. And I'm just wondering what the lessons are for a state like this in what you're talking about.
Yeah, this is a tough one because, the federal government really controls these tools, right? The federal government is imposing sanctions and tariffs and export controls, and it's pretty rare that state-level governments have any impact. But I think looping back to something we talked about earlier, Tom and I talked about earlier, when you are imposing tariffs on China or you're trying to impose sanctions on Russia's energy sector, which, Russia still to this day is, the biggest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, you do need to worry about domestic economic harm. And I think that one thing that we would be doing, in addition to sort of the strategic planning that I talked about before, if we were to do these policies in an intelligent way, it would be getting input at the state level. Because I think that, it is in many ways companies. And this, by the way, is a big lesson from choke points and something that I think people miss, by the way, about how economic warfare works is it is banks and companies who are implementing all of these policies, right? The federal government will say, Sberbank, which is a big bank in Russia, is sanctioned, right? But then it's up to banks to actually freeze those assets or stop transacting with Sberbank, right? You can say there's a 25% tariff on Canada, but then it's up to, a manufacturer here in Illinois to then actually figure out what that means for their business. And so I think it's very important for the government to have a very open dialogue with the private sector.
Hi, my name's Kenneth Newman. I want to talk about sanctions. And I was a supporter of President Biden, but I thought his sanctions were nonsense because I have some expertise on post-World War I Germany, Weimar Republic. I wanted food riots in Russia. The only way to bring Putin down would have been to have the country go into complete chaos, even if people were worried about their nuclear pile. But the bottom line is, could the sanctions that were out there but not used, do you think they could have brought down Putin?
Sanctions have a very poor track record of creating regime change. So I think like something that I think is also maybe worth explaining, because a big premise of my book, and I think a reality, is that economic warfare, and American economic warfare in particular, has gotten more impactful over time in a globalized economy, right? But there's still a limited tool, right? It's not the equivalent of invading a foreign country and overthrowing their leader, right? If you look at history, when we've tried to
track record on that is also not great.
Yeah, we're pretty good, by the way. We're pretty good at overthrowing foreign governments, but we're much worse at building sustainable political order, right? But sanctions can't even achieve the first thing, right? Sanctions don't even overthrow foreign governments, and in fact, sanctions perversely oftentimes strengthen authoritarian leaders, right? So I think another thing that's important is to be clear-eyed about the downsides of sanctions, right? I mean, they can, oftentimes the harm is felt most by everyday people. And to the extent there is behavior change, a lot of the times you have to assume that there's going to be pressure from below that then forces the government to change their policy. By the way, that was kind of the transmission mechanism for Iran, right? Where Iran fell into a terrible economic crisis in 2013. They had a presidential election. One guy, 2 weeks before the election, Hassan Rouhani, in a nationally televised debate, came out and said, hey, maybe we should negotiate on the nuclear program to try to get these sanctions lifted. And as some of you know, in authoritarian countries, people almost never speak the truth. This guy speaks the truth, and he wins 52% of the vote in an 8-person field. And so even though he's not number one, he's number 2 behind Ayatollah Khamenei, you're Ayatollah Khamenei, you said, oh my God, 52% of the people just voted for this guy because he wants a nuclear deal. We better negotiate, right? Russia, I think, is a little harder because Putin, I think, is in some ways even more authoritarian than Ayatollah Khamenei. At the same time, I do kind of agree with you that I think, while Biden deserves credit for doing quite a bit in 2022, I do think we sort of took our foot off the gas after that first month. And if you look at the sanctions that were imposed, 90% of the most important ones were imposed in the first 30 days after the invasion happened. And that was actually something I, myself, as an analyst, got wrong. I assumed that we would be sort of on a conveyor belt into maximalist Iran-style sanctions within a matter of 6 months, but we didn't get there. And it was really because of this concern about domestic inflation. I wish Joe Biden, could have, in May of 2022, spoken to the American people and say, look, maybe we'll have a little bit worse inflation, a little bit higher oil prices for the next 6 to 12 months, but it's worth it to try to get this war over with. And we're going to do really tough sanctions on Russia. Instead, he tried to have his cake and eat it too. He said, we're going to sanction Russia, but we're not going to affect the oil sector. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, Art Franczek, IBEC. My question is the cost effectiveness of sanctions, which you've been discussing more or less throughout your whole talk. And are the cost of implementation, the workaround of the sanctions, as the Russians have done with the shadow fleet to avoid the price caps, the workaround going through countries like Georgia, going to Kazakhstan, going to Turkey to import technological goods, are these workarounds greater than the effect that you desire to achieve in changing the behavior of Russia? When you compare your cost-benefit ratio?
Yeah, no, really, that's an important question. I think something that is an important lesson about how sanctions work is that the impact of sanctions is never, ever static, right? Because at the very least, if say you have a sanction in place today, the target of that sanction is adapting over time. So if you don't do anything, if all you do is leave today's sanctions in place, actually over time, they weaken because every single day, the target is adapting. So truly, even just to maintain the current level of pressure, you have to escalate gradually over time. And if you want to increase pressure, you have to escalate even more than the target is adapting. In terms of Russia and the shadow fleet, sometimes I hear people talk about the Russians as these sanctions evasion magicians. They've come up with these brilliant strategies that have felled American sanctions. That is not true. What Russia is doing is they are taking advantage of gaps in the sanctions program. They're not actually violating the sanctions with the shadow fleet. In fact, the US Treasury Department explicitly said that Russia could sell oil above the price cap if they were using non-G7 tankers and non-G7 insurance. This was a explicit objective of the Biden administration. So this actually ties back into the previous gentleman's question, which I think Biden was way too weak, specifically on Russia's energy sector. On the flip side, let's say we do a counterfactual. If you had done the price cap in 2022 and said that anyone who buys Russian oil for above $60 a barrel is going to get sanctioned by the US. So if you're an Indian refinery and you're buying Russian oil for $70 a barrel, you're going to be sanctioned. Or if you're an oil trader in Dubai and you're buying Russian oil for $70 a barrel, you're going to be sanctioned. That's what's known as secondary sanctions. It's what we used against Iran. If we had done that, I promise you, the price cap would have been much more effective. It would have involved diplomatic risk. It would have involved very uncomfortable conversations with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Turks. But guess what? We had those uncomfortable conversations in 2012 and 2013 in the lead up to the Iran nuclear deal. It was the same players. And in fact, when I was working on Iran sanctions, my job was the Asia Pacific portfolio. I used to go to these countries and literally talk to the shipping companies and the refiners. I was in my late 20s at the time. And I would come and say, I'm from the US government, and I'm sorry, but if you keep doing business with Iran, we're going to sanction you. And it's a very uncomfortable conversation to have. But if we didn't have those conversations, we would have never gotten the Iran nuclear deal. We were not willing to do that with respect to Russia, and I think that was a problem.
Do you mind if I just take one moment of, I guess, moderator's privilege and ask a question that just came in online, which actually I think is quite interesting. Folks may have seen, the question is basically, what do you make of the fact that Japan and Korea and China have ostensibly been cooperating to respond to the Trump tariffs, which is not exactly, the group of three that you would normally expect. And we'll turn to you in just a moment, but that is an important question.
This is why I am worried about American economic dominance. And this is why I'm worried about the future of the dollar. Because I think when the US was just weaponizing these choke points against China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, you could still envision a global economy where you may have two blocks, right? Where you'd have a block of the US and our allies, which, by the way, just the US and other democracies are still something like half of global GDP, right? So it's a lot. You have a big block of the US and Europe and North America. But I think what the problem is when, Trump came out with those tariffs, it wasn't just China, right? I mean, Japan got a 26% tariff. Korea got a 25% tariff or something like that. Vietnam got a higher tariff than China did, right? I mean, so if you're doing that, you're just basically telling everyone that they have to hedge against you, right? And so in some ways, by the way, it reminds me a little bit of Trump in the first term, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal unilaterally. As people forget this, literally the British, French, and Germans came together to try to create a system to evade American sanctions. So what we see is when Trump acts arbitrarily, capriciously with respect to economic warfare, he doesn't necessarily hurt our enemies. What he does is he encourages our allies to team up with our enemies.
Hey, thanks for coming to Chicago. Go stand for GSB. Glad you're here. My name's Fritz Kagi. I wanted to ask you about the confiscation tool as part of the mix, because in World War I and World War II, that was part of the mix. You're a belligerent. You have no due process rights as a foreign government. We're at war with you. Your assets are confiscated. This could have been done with Ukraine. Yep. Foreign governments have no due process rights on their assets, but they didn't do it, and they could have used it to fund the counterpressure. And that, I would think that will be a very important tool in defending Taiwan, that China invades Taiwan, maybe there's a war declaration, maybe there's not, but it'll be declared, your bonds are confiscated, and we're going to use it to fund the war against you.
Yeah.
What do you think is the future of this in terms of the stomach and the tools the government has ready to use that?
Yeah, so just to level set everyone here, we talked about the Central Bank of Russia having something like around $300 billion in assets that were in the West, right? So in European, American, Japanese, British bank accounts. If you look at actually how this has played out, and there's been a debate really since 2022, should we keep these assets frozen? Or should we actually seize them, confiscate them, as you say, and then repurpose them to support Ukraine? In the US, Congress actually last year, or maybe even a year before that, explicitly authorized the US to confiscate Russian sovereign assets to aid Ukraine. Canada's done the same thing. The UK has done the same thing, right? The problem is, between those three countries, we've got something like 10 or 20% of the assets. Most of them are in Europe, right? And something like 200 billion are literally in Belgium. And so the big obstacle to this has been the EU. European governments have not felt comfortable with confiscation. I think that the Germans in particular have worried that this could in some way be like terrible for the Eurozone and even fatally wound the euro. And so this has been, I think, an area where the Europeans, I think, have not acted with the resolve that's necessary. I think it would have been a good decision. The thing that some people miss, though, is at the very end of the Biden administration, so late 2024, the Europeans did agree to actually use the revenues from those assets to fund a loan to Ukraine of $50 billion. And so we were moving in that direction. And by the way, I think right now, interestingly, we're Donald Trump to go to the Europeans and say, look, if you confiscate these assets, we will continue to support Ukraine. I think the Europeans would do it because I think they're petrified of Trump and they don't want Trump to cut support. And if you think about the scale, just like the scale of the assets in Belgium, which are like $200 billion, right? That's like almost twice the full amount of assistance the U.S. has provided to Ukraine since 2022. So it's a lot of money. It's not enough, by the way. There's already been more than $500 billion worth of damage to Ukraine, so the reconstruction bill is higher. But still, it would go a long way. And by the way, I think from a diplomatic standpoint, it would send a very clear message to Putin and Lavrov that they can't just wait out the Ukrainians if they had effectively a $300 billion fund that would support them for years down the road.
In a Taiwan scenario?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because I think with China, there's many more ways China can retaliate, right? And so I think it's possible, right? If you had a war over Taiwan, that you would seize Chinese assets to use to support the Taiwanese. I think it's a harder situation too, because even just from this gets into a little bit wonky territory, but even in a military situation, Taiwan's an island, so resupplying Taiwan and aiding Taiwan in the middle of a war scenario, the way we have with Ukraine, would be much harder, right? Because you couldn't send weapons into Poland and drive them across the border. You're going to have to break a Chinese naval blockade basically to get to Taiwan.
Hi, my name is Eric Mao from the Geopolitical Forum. And you mentioned that economic sanctions have a poor track record in terms of accomplishing its goals. But on the other hand, you advocated economic sanction, even went so far as calling those people who have second thoughts or against it as lack of will. Maybe they saw what you saw, which is the poor track records. They're just not contradicting themselves. So how do you explain that?
Yeah. So I think it's so interesting. And, people, as someone who works on these topics, I'm often asked, do sanctions work, right? Something I never once heard when I was working at the Pentagon is, does a bomb work? Well, yeah, a bomb can blow up something, but it doesn't always get you what you want. Same is true of sanctions, right? Tools of coercive statecraft, whether it's military force or economic warfare, don't always lead to the outcomes we want, right? And we should only be using these tools, whether they're military force or economic warfare, when there are vital U.S. national security threats at stake, right? So I think we should be using sanctions less, but when we do use them, I think we should be using them with greater determination and will. And I will say, I never answered your initial question. What does a success of sanctions look like? Look at the Iran nuclear deal, right? We literally stopped Iran from developing a nuclear weapon without sacrificing a single American life, right? By just literally signing documents in the Treasury Department and the White House imposing sanctions on Iran. In some ways, we forget about how miraculous that was. I remember when we got we froze Iran's nuclear program in November of 2013. It was November 24th, 2013. We were in shock. We were like, this worked? Really? We were all worried that this would lead to war eventually, right? And so sanctions can work, but it does take strategy, determination. And by the way, that Iran sanctions campaign was one that was started in the second Bush administration, the second Bush term, was brought forward during President Obama's first term. Actually, the same official, Stuart Levy, is a main character in my book, Choke Points, initially a Bush appointee who was reappointed by Obama. It takes that kind of long-term strategy. And sadly, we haven't had that in the U.S. recently.
Okay, my name is Barry Greenman. Are leaders in Western democracies afraid to game plan economic warfare because they're afraid that the people in these democracies would not support such a version of warfare?
Afraid to game plan it, you said?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think there's fear of game planning. I think there's lack of strategy and lack of resources, right? So if you look at the office, for instance, in the Commerce Department, the Bureau of Industry and Security that does export controls, their mandate has effectively gone up by an order of magnitude in the last decade, from not doing very much to effectively executing a technological siege of China, and their budget has been totally flat, right? You look at the Treasury Department, the entire Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence has 700 people in it, right? That it does not just sanctions, but, the Bank Secrecy Act, AML, KYC, everything, all of sort of counter-terrorist financing, we have too few resources dedicated to it. And by the way, I just mentioned, the name of this division at Treasury is the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. These are clearly organs that were built for a different era. They were built post 9/11 with the Patriot Act in many cases for a mission that was much narrower than today's great power competition with China and Russia.
And maybe I'll just, if I could just kind of weigh in on that, because Eddie had referenced the Bureau of Industry and Security, which was part of Commerce. And I worked with them every day for years and years and years. It's one of those things that people often don't understand about how our government works, right? They're investigators, human beings who are on the ground trying to find items that are slipping through these nets, right? And there is a limit to what they're able to do and what they're able to find. And so there are limits to the capacity of what the government can do, and these people are stretched incredibly thin. So to find the time and the bandwidth to advance plan takes an immense amount of resources they don't have. 35 hours in the day kind of thing.
Hi, my name is Tamara Lambert. I had a question about BRICS. So as I was listening to you speak, it sounded like BRICS is not quite competitive with the dollar. But a couple of years ago, I was reading articles about the BRICS currency, and it sounded like it might become competitive. So my question is, how long do you think it'll be before BRICS becomes competitive? And does it really have a chance of becoming a world reserve currency?
Yeah, great question. Look, I think that the odds of the BRICS issuing a joint currency are quite low because it would require effectively countries as diverse as Brazil, China, and India coming together the way, Germany and France did with the euro, right? Where, China and India view each other as rivals. If you go to New Delhi, they're very worried about China, right? So I think the odds of a joint currency are very low. I think what's higher likelihood and more serious is that they are innovating in ways to use digital currencies to clear cross-border transactions. So they have programs where instead of using correspondent bank accounts, which are these dollar bank accounts in New York City, where it's actually how a lot of cross-border transactions happen today, you would use the Chinese central bank digital currency and a Brazilian central bank digital currency to basically clear a transaction. So it's a little bit wonky, but I think it is possible that they could innovate with sort of next generation payment systems, but I don't see it very likely that they actually build their own unified currency.
So I'm being directed to wrap us up, but we've got one more person, and even though it's a school night, I'm going to just go ahead and take my privilege and ask you to go ahead and ask your question.
My name's Richard Prince. I appreciate it because I'm out later than my usual bedtime.
There you go. Me too. I'm
ready for bed.
Sanctions are a tool. And all tools take a learning period. There's a learning curve before you can master any tool. Where are we at on the mastery learning curve for sanctions?
Ooh, that's a good last question, I think. I think unfortunately we have in some ways shot first and asked questions later, right? We use sanctions a lot more than we've learned about them. And I think that this is honestly, to sort of take this full circle about why I decided to write choke points. Even, people I respect working in the Biden administration, working on the Russia sanctions in 2022, I was concerned that they weren't really deriving lessons from the Iran sanctions in the lead up to the JCPOA. And I think part of that is because really outside of the happenstance, if you're one of the few people who's actually worked on these things directly, there hasn't been this go-to resource where you could actually read about it, where you could learn about it. There haven't been classes to teach you about it. So my hope is that that with choke points, with more people teaching classes on this topic at universities around the country that gradually will get that learning. But I don't think we're going to learn unless we actually make a strategy to do it. And I'm hoping that my book can play a very small part in that.
Well, I think that is a terrific way to end it. And for anybody who is curious about it and who wants to learn, the book is right over here. So I would strongly encourage you to go ahead and check it out if you don't already have it. But just, Eddie, thank you for being here and for being with this audience. Just a wonderful and remarkably timely conversation. So thank you very much.